Okay, this is B2 vaccines. Now, the idea of a vaccine is to introduce artificially a microorganism, or more correctly, let's call it a pathogen, a microorganism that causes a disease, to artificially introduce that into somebody, usually by injecting it in there, to provoke an immune response, to cause your body to respond to that attack. Normally when we become ill and a microorganism gets into our body, the white blood cells will respond to the invasion by detecting the presence of antigens on the surface of the microorganism. So let's have our invading microorganism here. We can tell it's a nasty one because it's got an angry face. White blood cells would detect these shapes, these chemicals on the outside of the bacteria in this case, and they would detect the shape, recognise that it's a shape that is alien to the body, it's not your own body cells, and would attack them. Now what we do in the case of vaccinations is we would deliberately infect someone with these pathogens. Now of course the problem is, what if you got really sick? So what would happen is, rather than injecting somebody with the normal live version of the pathogen, you would inject them with a weakened or dead form of the pathogen. Notice that the antigens are still on the outside, they've not been affected. The actual thing that's going to cause you problems, the pathogen itself, is dead or weakened, but the antigens are still there, and so the body will still respond to it. And it turns out that it's not 100% perfect, because live pathogens would behave in a different way to dead pathogens. So actually, if you can have them weakened rather than dead, you tend to get a better vaccination. So what will happen is, if we draw this out as a graph, normally what would happen if we injected one of these pathogens into people's bodies, your body would respond by making more white blood cells and it would fight it off. Okay, some of these remain behind, if you need to watch the clip on white blood cells, as memory cells. So the next time you come across this disease or this pathogen, perhaps you catch it naturally, the memory cells jump straight into action and you get a huge number of antibodies made to fight off the infection. So by introducing this dead or weakened pathogen, you fool the body into making lots of the right types of white blood cells. Now there are a couple of problems with vaccinations. First of all, the problem what we call side effects. These are unwanted effects that would happen. Now we can't unfortunately say that all vaccines are safe, and this is where the problem comes. If 10,000 people were vaccinated and we said yes it's safe, and then one person had bad side effects, you know, for that person it would be extremely unfortunate for them. But if they turned around and said, well, you said it was safe, there can be problems. So what you often find is people saying, well, yeah, it's probably going to be safe. The chance of having side effects is going to be pretty low. Some people don't like this idea. You know, they would get very worried about it, particularly if you were in charge of, if you had a child and it was your responsibility to decide whether they got vaccinated or not. Some people would look at the risk and think, well, the risk, what if I have, you know, what if my child has bad side effects? So you're always trying to weigh up the risk of possible side effects against the risk of benefits. Now, although there can always be, you know, severe side effects, there's always a chance of that. In reality, we find that actually the risk is generally very, very low. Certainly if we compare to the benefit of not catching that disease. For example, something like measles is a fatal disease in 1 in 10,000 people. So if there was a severe outbreak, 1 in 10,000 people got measles, we might expect to die, particularly if it was young children. there's something like a 1 in 4,000 chance of disability. What are the risks of having severe side effects? Much lower than that. And so we're constantly having to compare those two risks and benefits. What we try to do, or what medical staff will try and do, is immunise or vaccinate enough people so they get what's called herd immunity. Now, herd immunity is the idea that you don't actually have to immunise everyone to get rid of the risk of disease. Let's imagine if we had a population of people, the idea being that let's vaccinate some of them, let's vaccinate these people over here. We've not vaccinated everyone, but if somebody gets the disease, it's not as likely to be able to pass through to other people in the population because there just aren't as many people that you're going to come into contact with. So the idea is you don't need to immunise everyone. Who doesn't get immunised? Well, ideally we'd save that for people who are particularly at risk from vaccinations, which might be people who are already pretty ill or have certain conditions which would make it a risk if we introduce those vaccinations to them. So by vaccinating enough people, we can possibly avoid it passing on into the general public. We find that there are certain numbers, for example measles, you really need about 90% or 90% plus of people to be vaccinated to prevent it getting passed on. And it depends really on how the disease is passed on. Is it airborne, in which case you're going to need a lot of people to be immunised. If it's something passed on by direct contact, probably wouldn't need as many people to have things passed on by. It's worth also mentioning here the problem with, any geographers there might recognise this, less economically developed countries or third world countries, poorer countries which probably don't have as a well developed medical system. But the main problem is if people have weakened immune systems, and this is usually because of a lack of protein. So in areas where there aren't as much protein going around, protein is used to make things like antibodies. So lack of protein, lack of antibodies, weakened immune system. And it can mean that in less economically developed countries or poorer countries, infectious diseases tend to be more common, and one of the reasons is that the immune systems aren't as well developed. But by vaccinating people, if their immune system isn't very strong to start with, you may find the vaccination doesn't actually work, it doesn't take hold. And so it's not 100% certainty of getting a vaccination. And some diseases as well, the vaccinations for whatever reason just don't seem to take hold as well. TB, for example, maybe only works for about 75% of cases, which is one of the reasons why vaccinations don't happen anymore. Smallpox, which has been eradicated since about 1980, the vaccination was very, very successful. And that was what helped us to eradicate that completely from the world. So, key to vaccinations then, dead or weakened pathogen is put in, the antigens are still present, the body responds by selecting the correct white blood cells, we have the whole immune response in making the correct antibodies and so on, getting left with the memory cells, and they pass them on. Being able to compare the risks and benefits, the idea of herd immunity, that you don't actually have to vaccinate everyone, but the more people you vaccinate, the less chance it has of passing it on.